Good afternoon, and welcome to the 129th episode of the Veritas Fact-Finding Series. And this morning, or this afternoon, I'm joined by Professor Dimitry Anastakis. Good afternoon, Dimitri.
Great to be here, Anthony.
We're back again live to go on the ground and speak to industry professionals in an unscripted, candid video format to discover how we can make better investment decisions. If you're watching and you like what you hear, give us a like and follow us at www.veritascorp.com. A quick disclaimer here, this broadcast is not to be taken as investment advice, and participants and or employees of the Veritas group of companies may own securities discussed in this broadcast. And while we love all our guests, and Dimitri in particular, that's why he's back again with us, this session may contain forward-looking statements, opinions, and comments that we may or may not agree with. Now, I want to just give you a very quick reminder about Dimitri. He was our guest in January of 2023. And at that time, he was our 50th session. And we were talking about the state of the EVs and what was going on in the car industry. And the reason why we reached out at the time, Dimitri is one of Canada's foremost experts about business history. And he's the R.W. Wilson and J.R. Currie Chair in Canadian Business History at the University of Toronto. He's teaching across the Department of History and the Rotman School of Business. His research focuses on the intersection of business, government, globalization, with a keen focus on the auto industry, particularly after 1945. He's published 12 books, edited collections, including major works in the Canadian auto industry. He's a senior fellow at Massey College and the Bill Graham Center for Contemporary International History, and he's the founding chair of the Canadian Business History Association. It really caught our eye, and I think we sent it out to everybody when Dimitri had his opinion piece in the Globe and Mail. And it made me reflect on the last time we had you on, Dimitri, and how you opined. At the time, Tesla was double practically where it is today. And although I have to check this out today, this afternoon, as it's moving so quickly all the time, and you commented and brought to light how, as much as things have changed in the last 125 or so years of the auto industry, they're very much the same. And at that time, at the turn of the century, we had EV or electric, steam, and ICE or gasoline engines. And it's amazing how history tends to repeat itself. Now that we've gone through this election, it's going to be a great backdrop. Dimitri, maybe you can start really. I think I'm thinking in preparing for this, I want to go back to the 1965 Auto Pact. And it was a landmark moment here where the big three automakers chose integration over protectionism. You've argued that there's an important lesson for today's policymakers before they consider doubling down on tariffs. What should we be and they be learning from history?
Well, one of the key lessons that I was trying to impart in that article, which, was a kind of a letter to Donald Trump to kind of remind him of how things have evolved and why we're in the situation that we're in, is that in the 1960s, there was a similar dynamic to what's going on right now. There was a tariff fight between Canada and the United States over the auto trade. Back before 1965, there were two separate industries. One that was focused on Canada, one that was focused on the United States. Even though it was owned by the big three on each side of the border, they kind of kept to their own market. But because of technological change, and it sounds like a lot like today, instead of EVs, back in the 60s, it was automatic transmissions. And the fact that Canada couldn't build automatic transmissions meant that we and our industry was in big trouble. So the Canadian government took a bunch of measures to try to get the Canadian government in a better place. And that precipitated a trade war. And that trade war led eventually to the Canadian auto industry, which was owned primarily by the United States industry, as it is today, save for Toyota and Honda, working together with the government in the United States, working with the Canadian government to try to figure out a better way of doing things. And what they came up with was the Auto Pact. And the Auto Pact was this recognition of, getting rid of barriers is actually a much more efficient, much more productive, much more sensible way of using your home court advantage, which is North America and its auto industry, to help the American auto industry. And one of the things I said in that article was that, Trump was complaining and saying, hey, we have been, our industry has been stolen by Canada. And that was not at all the case. In fact, in the 1960s, in the early 1960s, one of the key drivers to try to persuade the United States government to integrate their industry so completely with Canada's was Henry Ford II. The Deuce, as he was known, was the grandson of Henry Ford. And he actually called President Johnson in the White House and said, there's this plan to integrate the industries. We think it's a good idea for the company. We think it's a good idea for the industry. And we think it's a good idea for the United States. And from that period, from the 1960s right up until today, the industry has operated that way. Obviously, there's been ups and downs. There's been, eras where there's been deindustrialization, foreign competition, technological change, offshore factories that came to North America. But by and large, this has been a very beneficial system for the American big three and for American consumers. And breaking this up is going to be very costly, as we're experiencing right now. I mean, the kind of pushback that we're getting and you're hearing about on an hourly basis from the industry itself, going to Washington yesterday and asking Trump to try to lessen the impact of these tariffs. It's a replay of what was going on in the 1960s. Detroit is asking Washington to be sensible about how the industry should function. And you see today, Lutnick and the president, he's going to Michigan to make a speech after he signs a new executive order, which is going to reduce the tariff burden. Now, the problem is, the best logical way of doing this is to have zero tariffs. And the way that things have unfolded, as we all know, for the last couple months, has been an incredibly volatile market because it's been so determined by the impulsivity of this individual. And, you never know what's going to happen. And, we're just watching this as observers. But if you're an investor, if you're a parts maker, if you're an assembler, you get up every day and you say to yourself, what am I going to be dealing with today? What changes are going to be happening? And this is why you've seen such a dampening of investment, such a chill on any decisions. And Anthony, if you'll allow me, one of the things that I wanted to point out, and I've been pointing out that's been pretty quiet and it's been kind of under the radar, is the fact that about 5 weeks ago, Ford announced that it was going to delay the launch of the 15th generation F-150 truck, not the EV, the actual F-150, and not for production, outside. This is the industry itself, and it's the most important vehicle in the North American auto industry. As we all know, the F-150 has been the biggest selling vehicle for the last 50 years. It's got its own GDP. I mean, there was a I think it was KPMG who did a study a few years ago that said that if you take the F-150 out by itself, it's bigger than Nike, it's bigger than Coca-Cola, it's bigger than a whole bunch of well-known brands on its own. The fact that Ford has made this decision to push that off, as soon as I read that, and it was a pretty small article in the Automotive News, one of these, industry publications, it sent a chill down my spine because it made me realize this is going to have an impact, not on the EV side of stuff, not on Canada, not on Mexico, but on the core industry in the North American sector. And if you're pushing that kind of investment off and pushing those decisions off, it means that the people at Ford know that there are serious problems that are going to be unfolding because of the tariff uncertainty that's been unleashed. And, like I said, as soon as I saw that, I thought to myself, this is bad news for everybody, and it's not going to do what Trump is proposing it will do.
I'm just, because I don't have a political view here. At least I'm not going to profess that mine, and I'm not trying to try to pick a side. But let's look back at not even that far back in history, but let's look during the financial crisis. Let's look at the big three: Ford, GM, Chrysler, as it was called at the time. Chrysler and GM needed government bailouts to get out, and Ford only avoided because they were able to get some costly lines of credit.
Yeah.
So Look, I'm all for jobs. I don't want to destroy jobs. It's not about that. But I read about the seatbelt. Apparently, the seatbelt goes from somewhere in Canada to somewhere in Mexico, crossing back and forth across borders for eight times before it gets into a car. Now, this is efficient, apparently, and it works because there's no tariffs. But how does that make any sense? And us putting, that's one issue. And the second issue, some may not know, but Boyd is a small organization that is on the other side of the Pacific. And they produce cars at a fraction of what we're producing cars at. And yet we have, put on tariffs on them already at near 100% to keep our organization, our industry going. So
How does it all? Yeah. It's a great kind of opening question, and I'll start off with 2008, 2009, which was the last time the industry was in this kind of
yep,
turmoil, and we ended up, as you pointed out, not just bailing them out, but we nationalized those two companies. It was Government Motors.
just so I can watch commercials while I'm watching the Leafs play and
Yeah,
the Oilers and everything.
it was Government Motors because the governments of the United States, Canada, and Ontario, people forget, all had a share of these two
Yes,
companies. And as you pointed out, Ford only avoided it because they'd been in trouble a couple of years before. They got a bunch of lines of credit where they even mortgaged the blue oval symbol to keep themselves afloat.
really.
So that's the kind of trouble that they were in. And the government did bail them out. And the government is going to do this because they see automotive as a strategic industry, a national security issue, a kind of technological importance that they're going to do this. The Americans are going to protect their industry no matter what they do. And this is one of the things that Trump is doing. So, and I hate to be an alarmist on this, but the way things are going, if things are not improved, you're going to start to see a lot more bottom line impacts. You've already started seeing it with Tesla in terms of their numbers going down, but you're going to start to see this kind of flow through. And I don't want to say this, but I have to say this. The
Say
auto
it.
industry at the best of times is the hardest industry in the world to compete in. You never know what's going to happen. You never know if you spend $2 or $4 billion on a product, whether people are going to like it and whether you're going to be stuck with thousands of them on the lot, which is exactly what's happening right now with Tesla and its Cybertruck, which may go down as one of the biggest lemons of all time. Having said all that, despite all that, all those issues, that seatbelt that you're talking about is the tip of the iceberg. The only way that the American industry and the North American industry can stay competitive, can continue to build here, is to allow that product to go back and forth across those borders to get the benefits of cheap labor in Mexico, to get the benefits of low cost electricity, and if it's a different product like a piston, aluminum production in Quebec, to get the benefits of the tool, die, and manufacturing sector in Southern Ontario, to get the benefits of finance capital in New York. So, all of this on a continental basis works together to try to drive the costs down. It doesn't make sense to you or I, but it's not just about lower labor costs. It's about specialization. It's about exchange rates. Canadian dollars are not the same as American dollars, which is not the same as Mexican pesos. So it does work at this kind of integrated level. And to try to unravel that is really, really difficult. It can happen. And I've said numerous times, in the ultimate goal that Trump has, there's absolutely, nothing wrong with that on a philosophical basis. To bring more of the production of the companies that your country owns back to your home country makes a lot of sense. But the counter argument to that is the companies themselves find it beneficial to offshore their production in that way to get those benefits. And the way that things have evolved for the last 60 years is that Americans and Canadians, and now in the last 30 years, Mexicans, have grown so accustomed to that ideal that it actually is really difficult to get out of the moment of doing this. And I'll just give you one example. So we haven't had tariffs forever in Canada.
Yep.
And it's actually almost impossible to figure out how you decide what percentage of a product is Canadian or American because, and this is a kind of historical tidbit, when they created the Auto Pact in 1965, because all of the Canadian industry was owned by Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, and they shared the same union, the same everything. When they decided to determine how the Auto Pact would run, they'd say, if you want to get duty-free treatment, if you're importing goods from Canada and you're a US producer, it has to be a North American standard. In other words, you had to have 50% North American product and content in your vehicle and your part to come across the border so it would be duty free. But they made it North American, Anthony, because the two countries were already so close together. They said it's a North American content. They didn't actually specify Canadian or US content. So now you fast forward 60 years later, and it's actually kind of hard in many ways to figure out what qualifies as Canadian, what qualifies as American. And if you're a small parts maker on one side of the border, or you're an importer on the other side of the border, you've never had to deal with figuring out what percentage is what, how you actually come to terms with what the customs regime is like, how you pay this, who you pay this to, does Customs and Border Protection in the United States actually have an apparatus to do this? So it's really hard to disintegrate when you've grown up only understanding an integrated industry.
So, it was hard for those using an abacus when a calculator came. It was hard when those that were on the wheel, like the horse and buggy, okay? There's an entire industry that was in horse and buggy. Can you imagine when Henry Ford came up and said, we're going to make this car? I can imagine that the guy, and you can speak to this better than with actual facts. I'm just hypothesizing that I'm sure that the horse and buggy guys went bananas, right?
Well, I'll tell you what happened.
Good.
There was a guy on the other side of the river in 1904 who heard about Henry Ford and his car. He was a guy by the name of Gordon McGregor who owned a company called the Walkerville Wagon Works, which was a horse and buggy manufacturer. He said, wow, exactly as you described it. He went across the river and he cut a deal with Henry Ford, and Henry Ford gave him the rights to build Ford cars in Canada. And that was the beginning of the Ford Motor Company of Canada in 1904. So it was a reaction by horse and buggy guys who said, we had better innovate.
But the horse and buggy guy did not fight the same way that the taxi the taxi medallion guys fought Uber. Yeah. They said, hold on, come on over, Henry. Let's see what you got. Maybe we can use some of our know-how here and build them in Canada. Is that?
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. And, if you want to fast forward, it's the same situation with EVs in lots of ways. Please. I mean, yep. We're in this transition right now, and it's a I've always said, and I said this the last time when we had this conversation, I said, this is a 20 to 30 year transition, and there's going to be ups and downs. And if I had said to you, Anthony, 10 years ago, if I said to you, 15% of the vehicles that are being sold in Canada, 12 to 15% of the new vehicles that are being sold in Canada every year in 2025 are EVs, you'd probably say, come on. But it's happened so quickly. And this is part of this dynamic where, we're in this transition where a lot of companies are trying to get there that are traditional auto companies like Ford, like Stellantis, like Honda, like Toyota. There's a lot of, born digital companies, born EV companies like Tesla, like VinFast, like BYD, which you mentioned, like all these companies that are doing this. And this transition is going to be up and down. It's going to be costly. It's going to have losers. It's going to have winners. And it's going to have winners that become losers and losers that become winners, just like the original rollout that happened between 1900 and 1930. At the beginning of your remarks, you said back in the day, it was EV and steam and ICE. Yeah. Yep. In 1900, 40% of the market is ICEs. Yep. 20% of the market is steam-powered cars, if you'd believe it. The last one doesn't go out of business until the 1920s. And 40% of the market is EVs. So we're going into that right now where, right now about 15% of the market is EVs and the rest is ICEs, but you may see hydrogen, you see hybrids, which is another kind of a mix of the two. And this
Yep.
transition is going to be a long rollout. And it, like I said, it's going to have winners and losers. And identifying those winners and losers is, it's a mug's game. Tesla has obviously been the key beneficiary of this transition. They were the first mover. They were ahead of the game. But as we know, Tesla as a kind of avatar and representation of this is a perfect encapsulation of the volatility of this, plus also this recognition that there's going to be winners and losers over the course of this rollout. And sometimes certain companies will be both.
All right. So you said it's a mug's game. You've been looking at that was thanks for making that point about the wheel and buggy, the horse and buggy guy, because I hope everybody paid attention to that. Like, that was unscripted, okay, right off the top of his head from 1904. Okay, so if anybody has a question, we are live. I will make sure that Dimitri gets the answer. So please feel free to type it in, and I'll make sure that I ask Dimitri. Now, so Dimitri, let's try to unpack the winners and losers, and perhaps you've given some dire warnings of what could happen if he doesn't take his foot off the pedal here, or off the neck or throat of, and I spoke to, we've had my friend Flavio Volpe on a couple of times, and he's told us also, I spoke to him since the tariffs, and he said, look, if it keeps going like this, there's only going to be unemployment. There's no magic to fix any of this. So now let's imagine we can make you lead here. And what do you see happening if you were to give our listeners here advice on how to position themselves?
So I see, and you can see it already, where Trump is climbing down slowly but surely on the tariffs. First off, it was, hardcore tariffs. And then there was a little bit of a softening. There's USMCA compliance stuff. Then he's decided not to stack tariffs on top of each other. So if you're already getting dinged on aluminum, maybe you don't get dinged on the auto tariff. And today he's announcing duty remissions, which is a kind of a program that the Canadian government announced last week in response to what's going on. And a duty remission basically is a structure where you say, I'm going to apply tariffs on your parts and your cars coming in, but I'm going to remit them. I'm going to give you some back if you increase the amount of production that you do in this country and you export it. So this is a kind of a shell game a little bit, where you say, I'm going to charge you, but I'm going to give you a lot of relief if you boost your sales. And both countries are doing that, in part because all the rules are broken. I mean, duty remission is normally prohibited under what was NAFTA, what is USMCA, and certainly was under the FTA. One of the reasons that we created the free trade agreement in 1988-89 at the behest of the Americans was because they wanted to get rid of duty remission schemes that we had for the Japanese. That's another story. But what you see is the pattern of slowly but surely putting enough exceptions, exemptions, lowering of the tariffs. So we're going to get to probably in the next couple of months, certainly by May 3, because in the next couple of days, those tariffs were supposed to be imposed, and that is going to be a killer. Any tariffs on parts, on major components, is going to basically put the industry into a standstill. So I think he's going to avoid that, because people in Detroit are freaking out, people on Wall Street are freaking out, and you're going to have, similar to what we had during COVID, during 2008, 2009, during 9/11, which there's a slowdown in the industry. It's like a border stoppage. And we already see this with supply chain. It's already been disrupted. So I think he's going to lessen as much as possible the tariffs and kind of declare victory if there's some tariff that is remaining. The problem is, is it enough of an exemption to keep the industry going, or do those tariffs, no matter what they are, and I think Flavio would say this, he'd say the only answer is zero, but I don't think we're going to get to zero. Is it going to be low enough to not cause as much disruption that it puts the industry in a standstill? I think it does. I think he gets enough exemptions that we kind of muddle through. There's going to be what it's going to be like was during COVID, where we had, a lot of inventory that we couldn't get. a lot of cars that oh, you can't get your heads-up display because we couldn't get the microchip. Well, you're not going to be able to get certain vehicles or certain types of vehicles because the supply chain is going to be disrupted. Some parts makers are going to go out of business no matter what the tariff is. So I think we're going to muddle through. By the summer, we're going to know if we're in a full-fledged recession or worse. There's going to be a downturn. And I think that the industry has no choice but to muddle along, because every year people need 16, 17, 18 million vehicles in North America. Where they get them from is a different question. So we're going to muddle along. But the disruption on the industry is going to mean the consequences of this are going to be much higher costs. And you're already seeing it. Average vehicle costs is spiking 5 to 10. In some instances on the luxury vehicles, it's going to be 15,000 more. Tesla's already raised its prices in Canada. They did a preemptive strike back in February where they raised their prices by up to $5,000 and $10,000 on some of their products. And you're already seeing it across the industry. So this is the first and most obvious thing. Prices are going to go up. They're going to be spiked because that's an inevitable outcome of the tariffs. It is impossible to avoid as the sun rising tomorrow. And it's going to mean not just immediate consequences for the cost of vehicles, but you're also going to see the flip side is going to be a shrinking in the types of vehicles, the inventory, what we can get. In the last few weeks, most of the industry has pumped up its output and gotten the product across borders, whether it's parts or vehicles, in a way to stock up on inventory to avoid the worst consequences of this. Well, the inventory of the industry usually runs on 60, 90 days, around that. So you can fast forward and you're going to start seeing stuff in the summer and really by the fall buying market where people are going to be like, wait a second, this vehicle, which was a Honda Civic that normally cost $26,000 is now $32,000. Wow. And I don't get a choice in the trim line I want, because the cars are not coming back and forth across the border. So you're going to see that. That's an immediate impact upon car prices, car choices, inventory, and dealers. Dealers are going to be very upset about this. And they're one of the most important aspects of economy. People often ignore the fact that car dealers are sometimes in small towns the largest employer in a town and have the most economic impact on a small town. You've driven through small towns, Anthony.
100%.
In every small town, there's a car row. And it's usually on the main street.
And so those guys are the big swinging, guys on campus in those towns, supporting all the sports, supporting all the little local teams. I want to transition, not transition, but let's delve into, because you said, you touched on something. You said recession or worse. You didn't say no recession. You also commented that there's going to be some winners and there's going to be some losers. So maybe we can unpack those two, perhaps as detailed as you can be, because I know you have lots of views on Tesla, you have lots of views on all the car manufacturers, and of course the parts. So, we won't hold you to it, but give us your thoughts on how this plays out, given, I guess, your overriding view that what's going to happen is we're going to have some level of tariff, but that there's going to be some back down from the 25% and a declaration of victory. It seems to me, just to make, I think if I were to take this away from just autos, the entire market believes that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be up from 4,800 or wherever we hit on the bottom on the S&P and gone back, to 55 or thereabouts. I mean, I think there's a belief that everything's fine, and earnings estimates are still, with 10% growth for S&P coming into 2025. Exactly. My toes are crossed as well. Okay, so give us.
So I still think the disruption is going to cause a recession. It's just the dampening on investment that you've already seen, the pullback. Most of the investments, the big name things that Trump has been heralding, there was a Nissan investment, there was a Hyundai investment. Those were already on the books. These investments, it takes years to make the final decision on a plant, on a new car, whatever. So these are things that are in play already. And most of the industry has said we're just going to continue doing what we're trying to do as best we can. The recession, talk, I'll say one thing. The stock market is not the broader economy. It's a great indicator and a big part
100%.
of the broader economy. And sometimes, Wall Street and Bay Street have great insight. And I agree with you. My fingers are crossed because I think that the smart money says things have to normalize to some degree. It's in nobody's interest on this. And it's not even in Trump's interest. It's not even Trump's interest, really. So, fingers crossed that we avoid the worst of it. But I still think there's going to be a decline. And part of it is all of that information and evidence we get from consumer confidence. And, consumption can switch on a dime. People's mentalities can switch pretty dramatically. We've just seen it in a Canadian election where things were going one way and then they went dramatically the other way. So, consumer confidence can come back pretty quickly. But right now it's cratering to the point that, that's going to have an impact. Probably 70 to 80% of economic activity in North America is predicated and driven by consumer consumption. Basic consumption, ordinary people buying stuff and deciding when they want to buy that fridge or that car or that computer or whatever. And because of all the negativity, you've already seen such a dramatic decline. It's actually worse than during COVID right now in terms of consumer confidence. So you're going to see a recession. I don't know how bad it will be. And that speaks to your other point about the broader market, not in autos. And autos is often the leading wedge, but we've got, a global tariff event happening right now with between the two largest economies in the world that do a lot of trade between each other. So, if things go sideways even a little bit, there's going to be not just a recession in North America, but there could be a broader impact all the way around. And I think it's hard to avoid. I think we might avoid the worst excesses of it. I mean, we got out of the COVID downturn, even though, we're still feeling it, pretty quickly, right? We avoided we had inflation and people, you and I are old enough to remember the early 1980s when it was 19% for a mortgage. My God, how did people exist? So we've gotten through that inflationary period, which was happening in the 70s and it was beaten down in the early 1980s. We kind of had a soft landing. Let's see what happens now. I think that we have the capacity to do this. Now, in terms of winners and losers, I mean, every shakeout in the industry that's happened has resulted in some winners, some losers. Chrysler was a loser in the 1980s. It had to get bailed out. It was also a loser in the 2010s, 2008, 9. It had to get bailed out. General Motors as well. Those companies survived. And I wouldn't say, they're necessarily flourishing, but they had enough life put back into them to avoid the loser tag. And because there's so few companies in the industry, in the North American industry, even though there's been a growth in the number of companies recently, you're going to see more losers and more winners. So I always say, this is akin to about 1923, 24, 25, where you had one dominant player, which was Ford and his Model T, and it was Tesla and, their Model 3 and Tesla in the EV market had more than 50% of the EV market, and now it's declined, just like Ford Model Ts were more than 50%. By 1923, 24, 25, you see a shrinking of the industry in the number of players, in part because of Ford wiping the competition out, but also because auto becomes so hard to do. And that's one of the things that we avoid this obvious fact is, for most of the period between 1945 and the 2000s, we referred to it as the big three because there was only three companies that had the wherewithal, the scale, the stature, the ability, the 150,000 workers to pull off auto manufacturing. It's really hard. It's really hard. Now we've got a whole bunch of new players in the North American sector. So you're going to see more people who win, more people who lose. Tesla is a great case here, right? Obviously a winner for a long time, set the stage, set the table, was the market leader, had an incredible run in terms of proving that EV manufacturing could be done at scale, could be done it profitably. Let's leave aside all the carbon credits that Elon was able to get. But, there were a couple quarters where a Tesla made money on its automobile operations alone without anything else.
Only a couple, let's be clear.
But that proved that he could do it. And, he sells 2 million cars a year. So it's doable. It's totally doable. Now, Ford, the Titan, went through this phase too, where they declined and they faced all kinds of challenges from new players in the market, new players who were able to do things, innovate a little bit differently. And Tesla's following that pattern. They have a very small amount of vehicles that they offer, really only 4, and really only 2 when it comes to mass market stuff. You know, the X and the 3 and the Y, really, the 3 and the Y. And then they don't have a lot of product pipeline coming down the pipeline. They had the Cybertruck, which is, you know, I know this is going to be hard, but it's a loser. It's a complete loser. It's a complete flop. I think, you know, they were scheduling, Elon wanted 500,000 vehicles a year on that product. And, you know, he's going to get 50,000, maybe. So Tesla's both a winner and could be a loser. And I hate to say this, Anthony, and I know this is going to sound really brutal, but it's not beyond the realm of possibility in a year or two where it's Tesla that needs a bailout. Tesla that needs a bailout.
And now I want to leave with a thought on EV, because when we had you on a couple of years ago, you brought up history and you said it was going to repeat itself. And, you know, at that time, all the major OEMs, not just here, but it was amazing to me when, you know, Mercedes was saying, and BMW and Volkswagen, listen, we're going to go 100% EV by 2030, some were saying. And so here we are, 2025, they've already reversed path. You know, just kidding, only EV, just kidding. We're like ICE is still around. And you know, as always, because we've had experts here on the energy space, on the like electrification space, and have just shown us that, you know, it's going to cost in the trillions to create the infrastructure necessary to change the installed base so you can charge that EV that you dream is going to all be throughout this country. So how do you see that playing out?
Well, you know, one thing I'm going to say is I don't agree with that premise. We've already got in the system 10 to 15% EV uptake.
Okay.
And I'm writing a paper about that very question about you know, charging, the access to charging. One of the fundamental differences with an EV and an ICE is you have your own gas station in your house if you've got a garage or a driveway. Okay. And the grid,
Except if we all plug our car in at the same time, I'm going to tell you a secret. You're not going to have any power, and I'm not going to have any power.
The grid is going to have, you know, it's one of the reasons that Honda made its announcement about trying to build a whole life cycle here in Ontario. It's one of the reasons that Doug Ford had these ads before the election about a kind of electrified Ontario. We have relatively, not as much as it was before, cheap electricity that is relatively green. So, you know, I don't think it's trillions of dollars that's going to be the cost of the rollout. It's in the billions. And it's going to take, like I said, it's going to take 20 or 30 years. And I know that there's a pullback on EVs. You know, unquestionably there has been. You know, the targets have to be expanded. But as a historian, the analogy that I kind of find the most useful in this situation is the same dynamic occurred in the 1970s with fuel economy and emissions and safety. And on all of those regulatory expectations, and they're not just regulatory expectations, we're trying to make better cars that less pollute, that are more fuel efficient. The government imposed expectations and mandates, and they ended up pushing them back over time. So, you know, the fuel economy demands of having at least 30 gallons per, what was it? You know, I get it, but making your car more fuel efficient took a long time, but eventually the car companies all achieved it. They just stretched the expectations out. I think the same thing is going to happen here. There's a 2035 target to have 100% sales. I don't think that's going to happen. It's going to be pushed back. But even if the take up goes like this, it's going to be eventually there. And the reason this is the car companies, consumers, governments all recognize this one fundamental thing. No matter how much you're a big believer in the ICE and how much you love cars, and I love cars, I've spent my whole life writing and thinking about cars. The fact of the matter is EVs, even, you know, before the cost structure gets fixed, EVs instead of having 20 to 30,000 parts in an ICE, you've got 2 to 3,000 parts in an EV. Instead of having a very complicated production process because you have to build engines that have thousands of parts within them, you simplify. There's no oil. There's almost no maintenance. They can last longer. EVs are better on almost every aspect in comparison to ICEs. And it's hard to get that right now because we're still at the uptake. But the car companies recognize this because they know ultimately it's going to be cheaper to make EVs, which goes back to the question about Trump. I mean, he wants to onshore auto manufacturing. But the reason auto manufacturing jobs have disappeared is less because of trade agreements and far more because of automation, because of robotics, because of the Toyota production system, because of digitization, because of all these advances in technology, which means in 2025 in North America, we're going to build about 17 million vehicles. We're going to do that with half the number of people that we built 17 million vehicles with in 1985. We're going to build almost the same amount of cars, but we're going to do it with half the number of people. And the cars that we're building are far more advanced, far more efficient, even the ICEs. I mean, the ICE technology is amazing. And I think, Anthony, your point about ICE is going to be with us forever. It will be. So will hybrids. This is going to be in 10 or 15 years where the mix in the marketplace will maybe be like, 60 or 70% battery electric plugins, and then 20 to 30% hybrids, and then there's going to still be a big chunk of ICEs. A lot of people are never going to give up their Lamborghini with its 12 cylinders. They just won't, because
these are guys like you and me, right?
Yeah.
That like to hear the noise.
Yes, yes. Though Ferrari has an engineering department that is solely working on making the sound of an ICE that they can add to their EV Ferraris so that people don't lose that sound. But, it's still not the real thing in my view.
All right. I want to wrap up, if I can, with a simple, complicated question. So today, in all this panic and all this fear, would you be buying the Magnas of the world, the Linamars, the Martin Rias here in Canada, and is the big three? I guess you think the big three is going to go through a slump, but yeah. Would you be now saying, look, it's already negative enough?
Yeah, I would buy I would buy these guys at this point, because I'm convinced by the inevitable fact is that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, people are still going to need to use a vehicle that's got 4 wheels. Maybe it'll have a steering wheel, but it'll have 4 wheels, and we're still going to base almost 90% of our mobility upon vehicles, motor vehicles, whether they're EVs or ICEs. So those parts companies are still needed to supply the production of these things, even here in North America. We haven't talked about China. We haven't talked about BYD, and that's the elephant in the room.
I did allude to that a while ago. Should we scrap this whole deal and just do a deal with China and we'll go Boyd all in and start making more Toyotas, more Kias, and more Boyds?
Hey, when we created our common tariff against the Chinese during the Biden administration, we did so because we were in the North American industry together. As soon as Trump kind of said, "Hey, we're not," a lot of people, including myself, said, "Well, if we're not going to get the benefit of being in North America, why are we imposing these 100% tariffs on these Chinese vehicles?" Well, the answer is because of strategic security reasons. There's lots of reasons that we can't trust the Chinese or whatever. But at the same time, in our own self-interest, it might make a lot of sense to say, hey, the Americans are no longer trustworthy. They're no longer dependable. We've thrown a lot in them. With them, we made an effort to get Japanese vehicle manufacturers here, Honda and Toyota, as you just pointed out. Why don't we make an effort to get the Chinese manufacturers here? We have a market that sells 2 million cars a year. Maybe they want to be in it. And a lot of people said this. When all this stuff started coming down, Anthony, I thought to myself, there's going to be 3 options here. There's going to be, we rework the internal kind of dynamic That's what Carney is talking about. That's what's happening, a kind of let's fix the situation we have. Or we go to a common external tariff, which is a real kind of gesture that says we're really with the Americans. I don't think that's going to happen. Or we go to a situation where we say, hey, you know, we're going to open up our market. We're not going to be beholden to this North American ideal. Maybe we do start thinking about the Chinese more as partners than as adversaries. And, you know, if you go to Mexico right now, you know, you can buy a BYD, you can buy a Chinese cheap EV for $25,000. And the Chinese are about 20% of the market in Mexico. One of the reasons all this is happening is because Trump is firing a shot across the Chinese bow to say, don't think about setting up factories in Mexico, because they're so worried that that's the soft underbelly. And that if American consumers start seeing BYD vehicles and trying them out, that the most amazing thing about Americans, and I'll give them this credit for this, is they're undiscriminating. They want the best product for the best price, which is why everybody is in North America, why Volkswagen has plants here and Hyundai has plants here and Mercedes and BMW, because Americans, unlike the Japanese who only buy Japanese or the Germans who only buy German, buy other people's cars. And, you know, they might buy Chinese cars, maybe, maybe not. It's kind of shocking to think 30 or 40 years after the Second World War, they're buying German and Japanese vehicles.
Yeah, that's right. You're right. Exactly. That's you know, I had never thought about that, but that's exactly right.
Their parents and grandparents were
Listen,
shooting Germans and Japanese, and their kids and their grandkids are buying VWs and Toyotas like there's no tomorrow. What's to stop that dynamic from playing out in 5 or 10 years with the Chinese?
at the beginning of our discussion, we discussed how within a matter of months, this population went from saying no way to please come. There's an excellent question here from Chris. Very early days, but we'd love to hear your thoughts on autonomous vehicles, Waymo, and how this autonomous vehicle industry, if I can call it that, plays out.
Well, it's like the $64 trillion question, because it fundamentally changes every aspect of how we understand mobility. You wouldn't have to worry about driving anymore, which would be amazing. So autonomous vehicles are still early stages, as the questioner might have said, but we're further along than people realize. We have an autonomous vehicle program here in Ontario. A couple months ago, I was on the DVP driving, and I saw an AV with the camera on top. There was a guy in the passenger seat and no one in the driver's seat going up the DVP. There are programs that are much further along in places like Arizona, California. We know that you can go and get an Uber that is an autonomous vehicle. Waymo is far along, though they've had some setbacks. Some of the companies, especially the IT companies or the Amazons of the world, have programs. It's very early days. There are a lot of technological hurdles to overcome. There are a lot of regulatory hurdles to overcome. There are a lot of legal hurdles to overcome. But most importantly, there are a lot of psychological hurdles to overcome. Humans, you know, they like driving, they like being in control. Maybe there's an easy switch where people get into the back of a car and they say, hey, I'm happy to do this. There was a really great article in the Washington Post a couple of months ago about a guy who wanted to test it out. He flew to Phoenix, and he said, I got into the back of an AV cab, and he said it was disturbing how quickly I settled into a sense of normalcy. And I kind of said, oh yeah, I can sit back and enjoy this. And within 5 minutes, he thought this is normal. And he wasn't worried, he wasn't concerned. So, you know, the technology and all the hurdles that need to be overcome are there, and the rollout's going to take a long time. But I think humans might be a little bit more able to ease into this idea of no longer having control. There's always going to be people who say, you know, I want to drive my car. I think about Sylvester Stallone in that movie with Sandra Bullock, where, you know, he's like, get rid of these crappy EVs, AVs. I want muscle. And he goes and finds himself like a Mustang. You know, there's always going to be people like that, and understandably so. The AV revolution is still a long way off, but it might come quicker than we realize.
It's amazing. And again, you know, it ties back to our human nature and how we, you know, can quickly adapt. And we learn that we learn that from what we've gone through in COVID. Like, who would have thought? I always make the example of working from home. When my staff would say, or my partners, "Hey, we're going to work from home." Work from home. Like, really? Now it's like working from home, and working from anywhere. And no one, I think it always takes a shock. And that's why I think what we're going through on the auto industry, as much as it's going to be painful, I also think it's something that probably needs to take place for a number of the different aspects within car manufacturing, design, etc. All right, I'm going to call it up. I'm going to wrap it up there. Thanks for the question, Chris. If anybody has another one, I'll be on for a couple more minutes here. On a lighter note, always like to ask our guests your favorite go-to breakfast, and if you have a restaurant here, perhaps likely in Toronto, that you want to recommend, since I know that's where you are.
Sorry, you just it's just talking about doing this from home. You just cut out in your video, in your audio. I couldn't hear what you said. Something about recommend in Toronto.
Yep, but your go-to breakfast and the breakfast restaurant.
Oh, my go-to breakfast. I live
Because I'm a big breakfast guy.
I live on the West End, so I like to go to Sunrise Grill, which is on Roncy, and they have a great one. And then there's Ari's Grill, which is also further down Roncy. And I'm a traditional guy. It's pretty much eggs, sunny side up, and straight up like that. So
No bacon?
no, I don't. I don't eat meat. I don't eat meat.
Okay.
But I love the hash browns. Love the eggs. Still do eggs. And there's a bunch of great places on Roncy. When I was living further downtown, and when Cora's was around the corner, I went to Cora's. I really like Cora's.
We'll have to get Cora to sponsor here. And last question, you've written a number of books, and besides your fantastic dream car book, that's a really interesting one. Is there another book you'd recommend for our audience to check out?
So the one book that I would suggest, if you're talking about my books or others.
Others' books.
Oh, others' books. Okay.
No, but if you want to throw in one of yours that you think is timely here, I mentioned the dream car one because I found that one interesting.
But. Yeah, the dream car one it's about a guy who builds a car in New Brunswick in the 1970s, and he's not successful. The one book, and I know it's going to sound completely dry and boring.
No.
But there's a scholar from Dartmouth University in the United States by the name of Doug Irwin. And he's probably the leading scholar of trade and tariff history in the United States. And, I went back and started rereading a bunch of his stuff because he has such insights about the long course of how tariff and trade policy has evolved over the history of the United States and the phases it's gone through. And he's been doing a lot of public speaking lately about this because he is the America's leading expert. It's his book is called, I think it's called A History of Trade in the United States. And the author's name is Doug Irwin, and I would highly recommend people get into it. It seems really dry. It's like tariff and trade policy, but it's actually a fascinating political soap opera of how tariff policy, which we kind of forgot about for many years because we were in this era of free trade, was actually fundamental to politics, the economy, and identity in the United States and in Canada for much of our history, right up until the 1960s and 1970s, when free trade really started to emerge in a way. So Doug Irwin, I would say, and I would give you also another Canadian author, a book called A Trading Nation. And it is a history of Canadian trade. It's not auto industry. Neither of these books are auto industry focused, though there's a lot of auto industry in them, but they're broader understandings of the evolution of how trade policy has been shaped by politics, by the economy, by identity, by race, by all these issues that we're dealing with right now, and that are really on display because we're at this clash point. In 2 or 3 years, things may be resolved, but we're going to look back on this in 20 or 30 or 40 years and say, this period between 2016 and 2028, that was the Trump era. You're going to be seen as a fundamental breakpoint between 1945 and 2024. And I'll just say one more thing, Anthony, and I don't want to take up your time. I was teaching until recently a course called Trump, Trudeau, Trees, Trade, and Other Stuff, which was
You
a
called it
Canada.
that?
I taught this course at U of T. It was a Canada-U.S. course, a comparative course, and a trade course. And I started off my my lecture by saying, 2016 marks the end of the American century in lots of ways. And then I just did another version of it where I was talking about free trade, and I had in my lecture outline the era of free trade in North America, 1989 to 2025, and I ended it there. And I thought to myself, wow, we're actually talking about this in real time as the end of an era, and it really is. It's the end of an era, but it's also the beginning of a new era. And if we're smart, we'll be able to take advantage of the opportunities that this transition, this crisis can afford us.
Dimitri, so much wisdom, history, and knowledge, and I love hearing how everything comes together. Whether it's with technology, human psychology, social study, everything matters, right? So keep well, stay on top of things, and we're going to check back with you.
You too. Thank you very much. It's a delight talking to you. And I really, the stuff I say, I'm jumping off the points that you're raising. So it's great to have this kind of conversation.
Thanks, Dimitri. Thanks, everyone. Stay strong.